Tau tēnā tātou katoa. Nā mihi nui ki ngā iwi me ngā hapu o te arawa. Nā mihi nui ki te whānau o te rioroa. Tēnā koutou katoa. So the brief is to talk about privatisation and commercialisation of state education. If we look at early childhood, it's already significantly commercialised. If we look at higher education, it's already significantly privatised. So what we're talking about, I suppose, in terms of a last significant battle is to preserve the notion that's actually embedded in statute, which is the idea that schooling should be universal and free at the point of use. And it's not. We know that it's not. That's due to privatisation, increasingly, which is exporting the work that you do in schools and early childhood centres to the private sector. Commercialisation for me is by far the most insidious because it engages us in identity work. All of us are engaged in practices. We challenge and question our own values in terms of commercialisation work. We say that we don't like it, but we do it. And we do it, we say, in the interests of tamariki, mokopuna, whānau and our local communities. So when Maury talks to us about neoliberalism, we need to remember that it's not just the outcomes of neoliberal work over 30 years now in terms of the increasing inequalities that are documented in PISA reports, in Child Poverty Action Group reports, in all the social and health indicators that we see on a regular basis. It's actually insidiously embedded in the work we do on a day-to-day basis, the moral judgments we make on a day-to-day basis. And in that sense, what we need to do in terms of our work with whānau and local communities is understand the appeal that commercialisation has in order to be able to speak back to it. So I've spent my adult life as somebody working in the public sector, as a member of a union, of somebody who has always held the view that private education is bad per se. Promotes social inequalities, it's bad per se. But now the boundaries are being severely blurred between what counts as public and what counts as private, what counts as for-profit and what counts as not-for-profit. And making those arguments and persuading parents of the effects of what goes on in our early childhood centres and schools on a day-to-day basis is much harder because there is a seductive appeal to aspects of what we do in the name of promoting the best education possible. So one of the terms that comes up is the idea of modernisation. The governments tend to talk about the need to modernise public education in the face of sedimented pre-industrial practices by teacher unions. In terms of sedimented pre-industrial practices for the financing of education. And we heard this morning from Louise and others that the terminology is changing, but what it's disguising all the time is the notion that the very way in which public education is organised is changing day by day. And in terms of what's going on at the moment in New Zealand schooling, and following early childhood and tertiary education is a process of substitution. It's creating ways for the private sector to enter state education. And it does this by making the work of businesses, charities, voluntary organisations and social enterprises A, essential and B, desirable. And if you think about the ways in which you're encouraged to work with some of these private sector actors, whether it's Pokie Machine Trusts or Manaya Kalani and the others, all of this is a way of commercialising and normalising the entry of the private sector into public education. And because it's being normalised on a creeping basis, it's far more difficult to say and persuade parents that it's bad because they can see some good effects. The values that are being socialised in terms of our work as teachers, our work as administrators and leaders, are the values of enterprise and entrepreneurship over the traditional values of service. So what we have now, as I said, when I was a little boy, it was private bad, public good. Now we've got a mix of for-profit providers, not-for-profit providers, including some not-for-profits that make a profit but say they give back to the sector, and the commons. And the notion of the commons is reducing. Parents are being seduced by ideologies that say the entry of for-profit and not-for-profit providers does good in a context where the state cannot do everything. Yeah? So if the state can't do everything, we have to bring these other people in. Yeah? It's a very persuasive, very powerful discourse. One of the things I've stuck in my report to NZEI, PPTA and NZPF is the notion that most of my life in public education has been a debate between the relative benefits of bureaucracy and classic markets. Yeah? Should we have the market or bureaucracy in education? What we've got in effect is new public management and a managed marketplace. But what we're moving towards is networks and clans. If you can imagine the major clan entity in New Zealand being the Runanga and the iwi groups, yeah? They are a powerful force for good, but they're also a powerful private sector force for good. Yeah? We're moving towards networks which are anti-democratic and clans which sit ambiguously in terms of traditional divisions between public and private. The language that the government uses is this notion that we haven't got all the money that we need to run a good public service, so we're now no longer talking about the government universally funding and providing, but government only providing a partial subsidy. The rest of the money needs to come from somewhere else. That opens us up to the private sector actors. Yeah? We've already heard from Louise and others about social investment strategies, yeah? And we now have mandatory cabinet rules that say we must consider public-private partnerships as one option in any capital building project and any services project. Yeah? And lastly, public-private are given parity of treatment. So Stephen Joyce talks about it being unfair in the tertiary sector to give different subsidies to private and public providers. That's unfair. That's inequitable. We have to give them the same. Yeah? So my question to you for these activities, if parents are exposed to these notions, how do you speak back to them? What are your bullet points that say the facts are these, the arguments are these, what government is telling you is a load of bollocks? Kia ora koutou.